The first time I saw that stretch of road again, the forest felt like it was leaning in on the asphalt branches, knitting together over the faded center line. The air, coming through the cracked window, was cool and resin-heavy, the kind of pine smell that usually calms you, but that day it sat on my tongue like metal. Off to my right, the old gravel pullout appeared between the trunks, half swallowed by weeds, its wooden post and trail map gray and warped from too many winters. The little information board creaked when the wind shifted a slow, tired hinge sound that cut through the quiet more than any engine or voice. A strip of yellow tape, weathered to a pale, brittle ribbon, fluttered against one corner of the sign like it had been forgotten there. Beyond it, the path into the trees was darker than it should have been at that hour, the undergrowth damp and still, as if even the insects were holding back. For a moment, I could hear nothing but the faint tick of the cooling engine and the distant rush of water somewhere below the slope. I kept my hands on the steering wheel, fingers resting on the smooth plastic, and I just watched that empty trailhead, the way you stare at a photograph you wish you could climb into and change. Before I go any further, tell me where you're listening from and follow if you believe some names should never fade. Most stories I carry from that time don't start in the woods. They start in small, ordinary places, the hum of fluorescent lights in a clinic waiting room, the smell of burnt coffee at the front desk, the rubbery squeak of sneakers on linoleum as patients shuffled in and out. Back in 2013, my days in Olympia were built out of those sounds. I worked the administrative side of a medical office off Martin Way East, answering phones, wrangling insurance forms, and trying to sound calm and awake even when the rain had been tapping against the windows since dawn. Every morning I'd park under a row of maples that dripped steadily onto the windshield, the air heavy with wet leaves and exhaust from the buses that passed by. I'd sit there for a second with the engine off, hands wrapped around a travel mug that never stayed hot long enough, listening to the distant hiss of traffic on the interstate, and thinking about how at that same moment Noah was probably somewhere on a campus across town, unlocking his classroom, breathing in dry chalk dust and the faint chemical tang of the biology lab. Our apartment then was a second-floor walk-up in a worn but quiet building on the east side of Olympia, a place that always smelled like a mixture of someone else's cooking and old carpet cleaner. When I came home at the end of the day, the hallway lights buzzed softly, and if I listened carefully, I could hear a TV murmuring behind one door and a baby fussing behind another. Inside our unit, the air felt different, cleaner, lighter, because Noah insisted on cracking the living room window whenever the weather allowed it. Even in February, even when it was barely above freezing, he liked the chill slipping in, carrying with it the damp scent of cedar and the distant hollow call of crows. He said it made him feel like the trees were right outside just waiting. I used to joke that if he could have rolled his sleeping bag out on the balcony and lived there, he would have. Noah's life moved on a steady rhythm between the classroom and the forest. He had this way of turning complicated science into stories that made sense, describing cell membranes like careful border guards or fungi as the quiet recyclers of the world. I'd watched him sit at our small kitchen table, under the yellow cast of the overhead bulb grading lab reports, with a red pen, the faint scratch of ink on paper, mixing with the low murmur of the dishwasher. On those nights, there was always a stack of biology journals at his elbow, splayed open, smelling faintly of ink and the dust of a used bookstore. He would trace a finger along a picture of some strange mushroom or lichen and say, almost to himself, "Can you imagine finding that under a rotten log?" He said it the way some people talk about seeing Paris for the first time. Olympia in late summer has a certain softness to it that you don't really appreciate until it's gone. The days stretch longer than you think they will, the sky turning this washed-out blue that feels thin around the edges, and the evenings are cool enough that you can leave the windows open without a jacket. On weekends, our neighborhood smelled like charcoal and cut grass, with the faint sweetness of blackberries warming on their vines along the back fences. The sound of kids on bikes drifted up from the parking lot tires, skidding on gravel, laughter bursting and fading. and from inside our place you could hear the whir of Noah's dehydrator on the kitchen counter, a low, steady drone as slices of morels and chanterelles slowly crisped over ours. Most people stored cereal or snacks in their cupboards. We had glass jars lined in rows filled with dried mushrooms and labeled in his neat block printing, each jar clinking softly when he moved them to make space. He'd been hiking in Gifford Pinchot long before I met him, but by 2013 those trips had become a kind of ritual woven into our relationship. On Friday evenings, while the last light faded orange over the apartment roofs, and the air cooled enough that you could smell the moss on the trees across the street, he'd spread maps across our coffee table. The paper had a particular texture to it, soft but crinkled from being folded and refolded, edges feathered where rain had gotten to them. He'd trace trails with the tip of a pen, murmuring names like Wolf Ridge and Boundary in a tone that made them sound like old friends. I'd stretch out on the couch with my feet in his lap, listening to the rustle of the map and the quiet tick of our wall clock, nodding along as he talked through water sources and possible campsites. Sometimes he would go alone. Sometimes I'd join him. Either way, it always felt safe because he was so meticulous. That was one of the things everyone noticed about Noah, the quiet care he put into anything that might go wrong. Before every trip, he checked his gear 2-3 times. The zippers, the straps, the seams of his boots, the smooth slide of his compass needle lining up with the little N. Our living room would turn into a staging area. His backpack stood upright by the door, already smelling faintly of trail dust and old pine smoke. He'd lay out his stove on the floor, thumb traveling gently along the cool metal, listening for the reassuring click as parts locked into place. He'd test his headlamp by turning off the overhead lights and sweeping that small cone of white across our beige walls, dust floating in the beam like tiny, slow-moving stars. There was always a list on the coffee table written in pencil and smudged at the edges with boxes he'd check off one by one. It wasn't dramatic. It was just his way. I saw another side of that care in my mother's living room in Lacey, where I'd sometimes end up on Sundays. Her place always smelled like lemon cleaner and old paper because she never stopped tidying, and she never threw out a receipt. She was cautious by nature, the kind of person who peppers everything with just in case. When Noah first started talking about his longer hikes around her, she'd tighten her lips and ask questions about weather radios and emergency whistles, while the evening sun slanted through her lace curtains, painting soft patterns on the carpet. He answered every worry with patient detail, how he filed his itineraries, where he signed trail logs, how he carried an extra day of food tucked at the bottom of his pack. I remember the sound of the grandfather clock in the corner marking each quarter hour as they talked, its gentle chime threading between their voices. Over time, even she relaxed when his name and the word forest showed up in the same sentence. There were little habits of his that only really stand out to me now. On weeknights after dinner, he'd step out onto the balcony with a mug of tea, even if it was raining lightly, just to look west, where the sky over the Black Hills darkened a shade slower. The chill would creep through the open sliding door, curling around my ankles, carrying with it the smell of wet pavement and distant wood smoke from someone's fireplace. He'd stand there, fingers curled around the warm ceramic shoulders, slightly hunched against the air, and watch the clouds gathering over the darker smear of trees far beyond town. If a crow called or a siren wailed off on the main road, he'd barely flinch. But when the wind shifted and he caught the scent of fur and damp soil, he'd close his eyes like someone hearing an old song. I used to tease him and say he was more rooted in the woods than the city. He'd just smile and say, "The woods don't send you bills." At school, from what I saw and heard, his energy was softer, but just as focused. On the evenings when I picked him up after a late lab, the building's corridors smelled like whiteboard marker and floor wax, and the last of the daylight slanted in through narrow windows, catching the dust in the air. His classroom looked like a small, contained universe, posters of ecosystems curling slightly at the corners, a tank with a sleepy turtle blinking under a heat lamp, shelves stacked with glass beakers that glinted faintly in the fading light. I'd stand just inside the doorway, listening to him run through a few last instructions to a student lingering at his desk. His voice low and measured, the tone of someone who expected people to try and understood when they didn't quite get there. Sometimes when the hallway had gone quiet and the doors were mostly shut, you could hear only his pen tapping lightly on the desk and the soft hum of the vent overhead. That calm he carried into those rooms was the same calm he took into the forest. In the weeks leading up to that September weekend, the heat had started to break. Olympia had one of those stretches of days where the mornings were wrapped in fog, the kind that hugs the ground and muffles sound, making tires on wet asphalt sound softer than they are. I remember stepping out of our building one Thursday, feeling that cool dampness on my face and hearing the faint drip of condensation from the eaves onto the hood of our car. Noah had been particularly animated at breakfast, fingers drumming lightly on the table as he talked about how the conditions were perfect for certain species up around Lake Tapshaw. The toast smelled like butter and a little bit of scorch, and the coffee had that bitter edge that clings to your throat. But all I really noticed was the way his eyes lit up when he traced the route with his fingertip on the folded map beside his plate. He'd been on Wolf Ridge before, he told me, but this time he wanted to branch off, explore a side stretch where the canopy stayed thick and the air stayed moist even in August. I didn't think much of that side comment then. It was just another variation in a routine I'd gotten used to, a different spur off a familiar trail, a new spot he wanted to check near a creek or a stand of old growth. The night before he left our apartment held that particular mix of smells that comes when you're half at home and half already gone. The rich tomato-heavy scent of the pasta we'd eaten for dinner, the faint chemical bite of waterproofing spray as he treated the seams on his boots, the fresh laundry softness of the hiking socks he pulled from the dryer. Outside, rain tapped lightly on the balcony railing, and the glow from the street lamp below spilled in through the blinds in thin stripes, striping his hands as he folded his maps and slid them into a plastic sleeve. The TV murmured low in the background, some local news anchor talking about weekend traffic and a chance of showers in the Cascades. He barely looked up. We went through our usual little back and forth about safety that night, leaning against the kitchen counter under the warm, slightly yellow light of the overhead fixture. The laminate felt cool and smooth against my palms as I rested them there. I asked when he'd text from the trailhead, and he said, as soon as I park, in that same steady tone he always used, like there was no question about it. He showed me his printed itinerary, the corners already soft from being handled, and I traced the line of his planned loop with my fingertip, listening to the hum of the refrigerator and the distant whoosh of a car passing on the wet street. It was all so familiar that it barely registered as anything but another weekend, another forest, another Monday evening when he'd come home smelling like smoke and river water and damp wool. The next morning I woke to the faint sound of the shower running and the smell of his soap. Something clean and sharp, like cedar mixing with the cool air seeping in through the cracked bedroom window. Dawn light was just starting to press against the blinds, turning them from dark gray to a soft, pale band of blue. I padded out to the living room in my socks, feeling the slight give of the old carpet under my feet, and saw his pack standing by the door, already loaded, the fabric slightly bulging at the seams. His boots were lined up neatly beside it, laces coiled and ready, dark leather still beaded with a few stray drops from the waterproof spray. The apartment felt quieter than usual, like even the fridge had lowered its hum to listen. When he finally shouldered the pack and stepped out into the hallway, the stairwell smelled faintly of dust and someone's frying onions from downstairs. I walked him down to the parking lot, the air outside cool enough that I could see my breath in little bursts as I laughed at some small joke he made about bringing me back a rock or a mushroom photo I wouldn't want to frame. His car door creaked the same way it always did when he opened it, and the inside smelled like old coffee and pine needles from countless trips, a scent that clung to the upholstery. I leaned in through the window as he started the engine, feeling the rough texture of the door frame under my fingers, and reminded him again to text when he got to Lake Tapshaw. He tapped his phone in the cup holder, gave me that reassuring half-smile, and pulled out slowly, tires crunching over the damp gravel. I watched his taillights disappear around the corner of the building, their red glow fading into the soft gray morning. The street beyond was quiet, just a thin sheen of moisture on the asphalt catching what little light there was. When I went back upstairs, the apartment felt a size too big, the silence settling differently without his footsteps in it. I set my phone on the kitchen counter next to the empty coffee mugs, its black screen reflecting the overhead light, and listened for the faint buzz that would tell me his message had come through from the trailhead. The refrigerator hummed. A car hissed past in the wet outside, and the faint smell of his cedar soap still clung to the bathroom doorway. But the phone stayed dark and perfectly still. The first sign that something was off came so quietly that at the time I barely registered it. Late that Saturday morning, the clinic was slow. The kind of gray, low-ceilinged day Olympia gets when the clouds sit heavy and the air smells faintly of wet pavement. I kept my phone face down beside the keyboard as I checked patients and telling myself I wasn't waiting for anything in particular. But every so often when the door swung open and a rush of cool air pushed inside, I found myself glancing over at that black screen expecting to see Noah's name. He should have reached the trailhead by then. He always sent me a quick text, just a few words, nothing dramatic, before he stepped onto the dirt. By noon, when the phone still hadn't lit up, I tapped the screen like maybe it had just fallen asleep too deeply. Nothing. The blankness of it made a small knot form low in my stomach, though I tried to tell myself it was probably just the dead spots around Lake Tapshaw. Those woods swallowed cell service the way moss swallowed old branches. When I got home, the apartment felt unusually still, as if the walls were listening. The air inside held that faint, damp chill from the open window he loved, mixed with the clean, sharp smell of the cedar soap he used that morning. His coffee mug was still in the sink, the last swirl of dark liquid dried into a thin ring. I touched the rim without thinking, feeling the cool ceramic under my fingertips, and I caught myself waiting for the sound of his footsteps coming up the stairs. A ridiculous thought, he was miles away by then, but that's how the mind works when it doesn't want to entertain worry just yet. I checked my phone again. No message. By late afternoon, a thin drizzle had started to fall, tapping softly against the balcony railing, the kind of light rain that doesn't make headlines but somehow gets into your bones. I sat on the couch with the TV on low more for the company than the content, and kept glancing at the window as if I might see his headlights swing into the parking lot, even though I knew he wasn't due home until Monday. It wasn't fear yet, just a quiet, persistent tug that something in the routine had stuttered. I scrolled through our last text thread from the night before. His final message read, "Should be a good stretch of trail. I'll check in once I park." Those words felt heavier than they had the day before, like they'd thickened overnight. Sunday morning arrived wrapped in that same silver-gray light, the kind that makes the whole world look like it's holding its breath. I woke early before the alarm. The apartment chilled from the night air sneaking in. The bed sheets felt cold where he should have been, and for a moment I just lay there listening. No shower running, no kettle on, only the low hum of the refrigerator and the faint patter of rain against the window. I reached for my phone on the nightstand. Still nothing. I told myself he probably reached the trail so early that he had stepped onto the route before the service bar flickered back to life. I tried to believe it. I kept busy that morning laundry dishes wiping down the counters even though each chore felt hollow mechanical like I was just filling space. Every time the washer clicked or a car door slammed outside, my pulse jumped. The air smelled like detergent and damp wool, the kind of quiet domestic scents that usually calmed me. Not that day. By lunchtime, I'd checked the weather on the Forest Service site twice. Clear skies. No warnings. Nothing to worry about, at least not on paper. I called my mother in the afternoon. She asked in that steady voice of hers if he'd made it to the trailhead safely. When I told her I hadn't heard from him, she paused just a beat too long before giving me the same line I'd been giving myself. "He's probably just out of range, honey. Those woods interfere with everything. Her reassurance should have felt solid, but her pause clung to me. That evening, the light outside shifted too early toward dusk. The clouds hung low, turning the street lamps into soft halos before the sun was even gone. I kept checking the clock, noting each hour he should have crossed some part of the trail. The apartment seemed to shrink as the shadows grew, the corners cooling and darkening in slow creeping ways that made me restless. At one point, I stepped out onto the balcony and let the misty air hit my face. It smelled of wet bark and distant chimney smoke, that unmistakable Washington blend that usually made me think of him. Instead, it made my chest tighten. I stayed out there a long while, gripping the railing, hoping my phone would buzz in my pocket. It never did. By Monday morning, the denial I'd wrapped around myself had thinned so much that it barely held shape. The sky was washed pale, the kind of soft, muted color that looked almost tender from a distance but felt cold up close. I called in late to the clinic telling Linda I wasn't feeling well. My voice sounded strange to my own ears, too steady, too clipped, like I was trying to keep something contained. I kept glancing at the clock on the microwave. He was 2 check-ins overdue by then. That had never happened in all the years we'd been together. Around mid-morning, I grabbed my keys, locked the apartment behind me, and drove toward Lake Tapshaw. The roads were quieter than usual, the trees along the shoulders dripping from the morning mist. As I wound through the foothills, the forest seemed to thicken, leaning closer to the pavement, the branches still heavy with moisture. A few times I considered turning around, convincing myself I was overreacting, but each bend in the road made my stomach clench tighter. The air through the cracked window smelled like rain-soaked pine and damp earth. The kind of smell that made me think of him pulling his boots tight, adjusting his pack straps, pushing into the trail with that quiet confidence he carried everywhere. When I reached the trailhead parking lot, the sight of his car hit me like a cold slap. His old sedan sat where he always parked, straight-centered neat, as if he'd only stepped away for a moment. The windshield was speckled with dried raindrops, and a thin layer of dust clung to the hood. I walked toward it slowly, each step feeling heavier than the last. The lot was quiet, except for the distant rush of water somewhere below the ridge, a constant low murmur that seemed to fill the space where other sounds should have been. When I reached the driver's side window, my reflection stared back at me, pale, tense, framed by the dripping branches above. I tried the door handle even though I knew it would be locked. It was. I peered inside. His map was folded neatly on the passenger seat exactly the way he left it. A half-empty water bottle sat in the cup holder. Nothing out of place. Nothing wrong. And yet, everything was wrong. I circled the car twice, feeling the coarse grit under my shoes and the cool dampness of the air settling on my skin. The wind pushed through the trees, and for a moment the scent of wet needles grew sharper, almost medicinal. I stood there with my hands tucked into my jacket cuffs, trying to convince myself I was missing something obvious. I walked over to the trail map posted near the tree line. The paper behind the plexiglass was fogged slightly from the moisture, its corners curling. I pressed my fingertips against the cool surface and traced the route he should have taken, though the lines blurred through the condensation. The path into the woods looked darker than usual, the undergrowth thick and unmoving, like the whole forest had decided to stay perfectly still. I listened hard, hoping for footsteps. Voices, anything, but all I heard was the faint tapping of water dripping from leaf to leaf. I don't know how long I stood there before a couple walked past me toward their car, chatting quietly about the weather. They barely noticed me. Their normalcy made mine feel all the more fragile, like I was the only one who sensed that something had shifted in the air. I stepped away from the map and took one last look down the trail, letting the silence press against me. The fog had started to drift in again, weaving between the trunks like pale, slow-moving smoke. Eventually, I got back into my car. My hands shook as I gripped the steering wheel, the vinyl cool beneath my palms. I sat there with the engine off, listening to the faint tick of cooling metal and the soft patter of moisture on the roof. I tried calling his phone again, straight to voicemail. His voice sounded too calm, too normal, like it belonged to another world entirely. When I finally pulled out of the lot, my headlights cut across the wooden sign at the entrance, making it glow briefly before the darkness swallowed it again. The road twisted downward the forest on both sides, pressing close. By the time I reached the clearing near the ranger station, the evening had started to gather the light, turning that muted gold that lasts only a few minutes. I parked under a dripping cedar and sat there not quite ready to open the door. A cruiser pulled in a few minutes later, tires crunching softly on the gravel. The deputy stepped out slowly, closing the door with a quiet thud. He spotted me through the windshield, hesitated, and removed his hat before approaching the car. The gesture alone told me that whatever thin layer of denial I'd been clinging to was about to give way completely. The deputy who approached my car that evening didn't rush, and somehow that slow, measured walk rattled me more than if he'd run. The air outside had grown colder, carrying the smell of damp cedar and exhaust from the cruiser that still idled behind him. When I stepped out, gravel shifted under my shoes with a soft crackle, and for a moment all I could hear was the low rumble of the engine and the distant rush of the river below the ridge. He asked a few questions in a voice that was calm, but just a little too careful the way people speak when they know they're stepping into someone else's fear. Then he radioed the station. His words clipped and quiet, and told me another deputy would meet us at the trailhead. I remember standing there, my hands shoved deep into my jacket sleeves, feeling the chill sink through the fabric while the sky dimmed into that dull, bruised color. It gets right before full dark. That was the moment it became real, bigger than my worry, bigger than any explanation I'd tried to soothe myself with. Whatever this was, it had already outgrown the boundaries of normal. By first light the next morning, the parking lot at Lake Tapshaw looked nothing like the lonely place I'd found the day before. Trucks lined the gravel in tight rows, some still ticking with leftover heat from the drive and others rimmed with frost. Their headlights swept through the fog, turning the air into shifting curtains of pale gray. Rangers stood in small clusters with their hands wrapped around travel mugs, steam rising in thin threads as they talked in low, steady tones. A pair of search dogs waited beside their handlers, the dog's breath coming out in quick bursts that hung in the cold morning air. The mood around that lot had that weighted stillness I'd only ever felt in hospital corridors, everyone focused, everyone quiet, everyone bracing for something they couldn't quite name yet. A large map of the forest, laminated and taped at the corners, was spread across the hood of a ranger truck. The surface fogged a little each time someone leaned close, leaving a faint pattern of breath on the plastic before it vanished. Red and blue markers sketched lines along the ridges and chute paths branching into smaller, paler marks where side routes tangled into the thicker woods. I stood behind the group, hugging myself against the morning chill, watching them talk through the plan. The air smelled like gasoline and wet pine needles, a mix that settled deep into the back of my throat. When they marked the place where someone had seen Noah last along that stretch of trail near the lake, it felt like a pin going straight through my chest. The first teams moved out along the main trail just after sunrise. Their boots thudded softly on the damp ground, leaving shallow impressions in the thin layer of mud. Radios crackled with short bursts of static, followed by calm updates, directions, coordinates, quick mentions of fallen branches or slick roots. I followed a few yards behind one group at the start, close enough to see the rhythm of their walk, the quiet choreography of trained people working through rough terrain. But when the trees swallowed the trail, when the forest tightened its grip and the light dimmed, a ranger gently suggested I return to the lot. "We'll bring you any news," he said, nodding toward the thicker brush ahead. His voice held no judgment, only concern, but it made me feel helpless in a way I hadn't expected. Back at the parking area, I waited by my car as more volunteers arrived, locals with backpacks slung over their shoulders, faces drawn with worry or determination. I recognized a few from the town grocery store or the college campuses around Olympia. They spoke softly to each other while signing in their breath, puffing into the cold air. A woman in a knitted hat brushed her thumb nervously across a compass on her lanyard. A man tightened the straps on his pack 3 times before joining a ranger to review the search grid. These were people who didn't know Noah personally, yet they stepped into the woods like they had something of their own at stake. That kind of kindness stays with you. As the morning stretched into afternoon, the first reports filtered back. One team radioed that they'd found a footprint near a muddy slope, but measurements showed it didn't match his boots. Another group spotted a scrap of fabric caught on a low branch, but when a deputy brought it back wrapped in a small evidence bag, it turned out to be part of an old tarp, sun-bleached brittle at the edges. There were moments when hope kicked up only to settle flat again. The sound of a helicopter came in late morning, a dull rhythmic beat that pulsed through the treetops. I watched it sweep slow arcs across the ridges, its searchlight cutting through the lifting fog. The downdraft carried the smell of churned earth and stirred leaves, sending a shiver of wind through the undergrowth along the roadside. But from above, nothing stood out. Nothing moved. I spent much of that day sitting on the cold metal step of the ranger station trailer, clutching a paper cup of coffee that turned lukewarm too quickly. Inside, the station deputies moved between radio receivers and stacks of topographic maps. Their boots made a soft thud on the worn linoleum floor, a rhythm that grew familiar as the hours passed. At one point, a younger deputy came over and sat beside me. He didn't offer platitudes. He just rested his elbows on his knees and said they were covering ground faster than they expected. His voice was low, steady, but I could see the tightness around his eyes. People notice more than they say. The dogs came back around mid-afternoon, tongues lolling, coats damp from pushing through the underbrush. Their handlers spoke quietly with the lead ranger, and I watched their faces closely, trying to read anything there. One handler mentioned that the scent trail had faded strangely fast, like it drifted in different directions, he said, shaking his head as he ran his gloved hand down the dog's back. I didn't know what that meant, but the ranger's expression tightened just a fraction, and that told me enough. Late in the day, a group that had swept the ravine near the southern spur returned. Their boots were coated in mud up to the ankles, and their jackets smelled faintly of moss and sweat. They had found no sign of a campsite, no broken branches that suggested a fall, no gear stashed under the natural overhangs. Ravines usually hold clues, shreds of clothing, torn packs, even footprints preserved in the dense, wet soil. But this one gave them nothing. One of the climbers rubbed the back of his neck, his hand trembling slightly, and muttered to a deputy that he'd rarely seen a trail go cold that fast. His words hung in the air like a slow-moving fog. Throughout the afternoon, whispers of theories circled around the station. Some volunteers talked about hikers who'd taken wrong turns and wandered for days before walking out on their own. Others mentioned wildlife, though every ranger within earshot dismissed that quietly. They knew the signs, and none were present. A few locals, older ones who'd lived near the forest their whole lives, spoke of sudden weather shifts or hidden crevices masked by thick roots and moss. Their voices had that softened edge of memory shaped by decades of watching the woods swallow and return things in their own time. But even those stories ended with something found, gear footprints, some trace left behind. Here there was only absence. As evening approached, the light changed again. The sky over the ridge turned a faded peach, then dropped into deeper shades of blue and gray. The temperature dipped, and the air carried that damp, metallic scent it gets right before nightfall. Deputies walked the perimeter with flashlights' beams sweeping across the cracked gravel and into the brush along the tree line. Their radios buzzed with check-ins from teams still pushing through the last stretch before dark. I stood near the edge of the lot with my arms wrapped tight around myself, feeling the chill settle into my shoulders. Every so often, a ranger would stop by to ask if I needed anything. Water, a blanket, a place to sit. But I couldn't bring myself to move far from the map, as if staying close to it somehow kept me tethered to the search. Fatigue crept in slowly, the kind that doesn't just touch the body, but seeps into the mind. Each time a team returned empty-handed, the silence that followed felt heavier than the last. The smell of wet bark, the soft crunch of footsteps on gravel, the steady tick of a cooling engine, every sound seemed amplified. I remember closing my eyes for a moment and pressing my thumb into my palm just to ground myself. The cold bit at my skin. The world didn't care that everything felt tilted. Then, just as the sun slipped behind the ridge completely and shadows stretched across the parking lot, a low murmur rose from the far end near one of the ranger trucks. A deputy walked briskly toward the command trailer, something clutched in his gloved hand. He didn't look around, didn't call out, just moved with a purpose I hadn't seen all day. Another ranger followed him, casting a quick glance toward the tree line where the last of the light was disappearing. Their boots hit the ground with a sharper sound than before, like the air had tightened around them. I watched them disappear into the trailer, the door shutting with a hollow thud. A moment later, a radio crackled from inside one short burst. No words. And in the thickening dark, I felt the shift, small but undeniable, like the forest had just exhaled something none of us were ready to face. It happened on a late August afternoon, 4 years after Noah disappeared. The summer haze had settled thick over Olympia that day, the kind that makes the air feel warm even in the shade. I was at my desk at the clinic when my phone vibrated once, then again, a tight, insistent trembling that made my hands go cold before I even looked down. The number on the screen was from Skamania County. The voice on the other end was steady, formal, almost gentle. A pair of backpackers had found something in an unmarked section of the forest south of Lake Tapshaw. The deputy didn't name it. He didn't have to. His pause told me enough. Within hours, I was back on that winding road, the forest closing in on both sides. The late afternoon light filtered through the branches in long gold bands that kept flashing across my windshield like the woods were warning me in Morse code. Far ahead past a bend, I knew too well I saw the shape of ranger trucks clustered at the edge of the clearing. Red and blue lights pulsed, softly washed out by the daylight, but unmistakably urgent. The moment I pulled in, the air changed, no birdsong, no movement. Just that thick stillness weighted by whatever waited inside the tree line. A deputy met me before I even opened the door. His face had that tight, braced look I'd come to recognize over the years, the one people wear when they're standing near the boundary between known and unknown. He didn't touch my arm or ask how I was. He simply told me they needed to walk in slowly, that the ground was uneven, and that I should watch my step. His voice was low enough that it barely broke the silence around us. And then we went in. The deeper we moved into the forest, the colder the air grew, though the sun still hung high behind the canopy. Ferns brushed my jeans, leaving thin lines of moisture, and the smell of wet humus thickened with every step. A ranger led the way, pushing aside tall fronds that slapped back softly into place after we passed. I could hear radios buzzing ahead, short bursts, overlapping voices, urgency without panic. When we reached a narrow break in the brush, I felt the deputy slow beside me. Something in his posture changed, as if he were bracing for me to see something I could never unsee. The clearing opened before us in a wide, shallow bowl of ground almost perfectly circular, the earth unnaturally bare compared to the dense forest around it. And in the center stood a massive old conifer, one of those ancient pseudo-firs that rise like pillars in the deeper parts of Gifford Pinchot. But this one was wrong. The bark had been swallowed by a thick, undulating layer of grayish-purple material clinging from the roots all the way up the trunk. It looked wet, but not with rainwater, more like a sheen of something biological, something alive. What struck me first wasn't the color. It was the way the surface shifted in slow pulses, subtle as breathing. Sunlight struck it in pieces through the branches above, reflecting in oily, iridescent streaks that made the whole mass seem to tremble. The air around the trunk carried a dense, sweet odor, something between spoiled honey and decaying pine. It clung to the back of my throat, made me swallow hard. Rangers moved around the perimeter, carefully, boots sinking slightly into the spongier soil closer to the tree. Every motion of theirs was deliberate, like they were afraid the air itself might break. A tape boundary had been strung along stakes hammered into the ground, though the clearing felt too quiet, too breathless for tape to be enough protection. Some of the investigators wore full protective suits, hoods drawn tight, visors reflecting the milky light filtering through the canopy. Their gloves shone under the faint sheen of disinfectant spray. I didn't see it at first, not until one of the forensic techs stepped aside, shifting just enough for the light to hit an object at the base of the tree, something slumped half lost under the slick gray surface. My breath caught like I'd been shoved underwater. There, wedged against a root embedded in the pulsing mass, was a backpack. Not just any backpack. His backpack. The same ash-gray hiking pack Noah had carried on every trip we ever talked about. The straps were discolored, bleached, and warped where the substance had crept over them. The nylon looked thin, almost melted. One of the zipper pulls, bright metal once, was dulled to a soft, cloudy gray. A ranger near the base of the trunk lifted a hand, slowly palm out, signaling me not to move closer. His eyes flicked to mine, apologetic, protective, and deeply unsettled all at once. Someone near the tree called out, short and clipped. Another answered. Radios burst alive. Protective-suited specialists crouched, shining narrow-beam flashlights along the lower layer of the growth. The beams revealed faint veins of pale blue light flickering inside, not constant, not rhythmic, just irregular, like distant lightning trapped beneath skin. Every now and then, a ripple moved through the mass, almost imperceptible, unless you were staring directly at it. I felt the deputy at my side shift closer, not touching me, but present a steady shape in a place where everything felt unstable. My legs weakened, and I had to put a hand on a nearby sapling to steady myself. The bark was cool and slightly damp, grounding me for half a heartbeat. Then even the tree felt too alive, too connected to the thing growing at the center of the clearing. They found more at the base of the trunk, small pieces of metal, a torn corner of laminated paper. The faint glint of a compass needle dulled by exposure. One of the techs knelt and brushed debris aside with a soft, bristled tool, uncovering the corner of a notepad. Its pages were crinkled and stained, edges warped from moisture, and something else, something that had spread across the cover like frost, except it wasn't cold. The sight of it made my chest tighten until it hurt to breathe. No one spoke loudly. The forest seemed to swallow every sound before it could rise. Even the radio static felt muffled. Eventually, one of the lead investigators approached me with the same slow carefulness everyone else had adopted since we'd reached the clearing. She kept her voice low as she told me they'd found documentation notes likely written by Noah during his final days in the forest. She didn't offer details. Not yet. She just said they would secure it and analyze everything thoroughly. But her eyes, steady and trained, carried something heavy behind them. Something that told me whatever had happened to him wasn't simple, wasn't peaceful, and wasn't the kind of accident people imagine when they think of the woods. I stared at the tree longer than I should have, at the way the substance clung greedily to its bark, at the way the roots seemed partly consumed, partly cocooned, at the way the air thickened with that sickly sweetness the closer you got. And then finally at the pack I knew by heart, the pack I'd watched him load 100 times. Seeing it there half swallowed felt like watching a door slam shut on all the pieces of him I'd hoped were still out there waiting to be found. Investigators marked off a larger perimeter, hammering stakes into the ground with controlled movements that echoed faintly between the trees. They brought in specialized containers, thick polymer shells that glinted in the dimming light, and began planning how to isolate the substance without disturbing it. For every piece of gear they set out, they checked the seals twice. The air around them carried the cold smell of sterilizing agents, sharp and chemical, cutting through the sweetness drifting off the tree. I heard someone behind me mutter that the site needed state-level involvement. Another whispered something about possible biological risk. None of it fit easily into the world I thought I understood. The forest seemed too ancient, too constant to hide something this strange. And yet there it was, moving, breathing, reacting to the warmth of flashlights and bodies. Before they escorted me out, the lead investigator placed a hand lightly on my shoulder. Her glove was cool, the pressure steady. She told me this was the first major break they'd had in 4 years, that what they'd found here would help them understand what had happened to Noah. She spoke gently, but even then I knew answers were coming, but they wouldn't be gentle. As the team prepared to begin their containment process, I stepped back through the brush with help from the deputy. The forest felt different on the way out. Air colder, shadows longer, the silence too complete. When we reached the trailhead, dusk had already taken hold, painting the parked trucks in shades of steel blue. Floodlamps hummed softly, their beams slicing into the darkness as more officials arrived. The clearing behind us glowed faintly with artificial light, a small island of human activity swallowed by the vast, indifferent woods. I stood near the back of an unmarked SUV while the deputy spoke quietly with his supervisor. Voices drifted through the cool evening air, talk of quarantines, protocols, specialists being flown in. Each word sounded like it belonged to a world far stranger than the one I'd lived in before. My breath misted in small, shaky clouds, disappearing almost as soon as it formed. They drove me to the sheriff's office in Stevenson as night settled fully over the county. The lights inside the building burned bright against the darkness, casting long reflections on the wet pavement outside. I remember stepping out of the cruiser and hearing the quiet drone of a generator somewhere behind the building, its steady vibration filling the stillness. Inside, officers moved with sober purpose, their voices low, their eyes cautious. They led me to a small conference room with a pitcher of water and a stack of tissues someone had placed there long before I arrived. I sat down slowly, feeling the chair's cold metal press through my jacket. My hands trembled when I wrapped them around the glass. Someone shut the door gently behind me, muffling the sounds from the hallway. Then the room fell quiet, deep, unsettling, absolute, as I waited for the truth to finish its slow walk toward me. The night after they found the clearing, I barely slept. The sheriff's office kept me in that quiet conference room for what felt like hours, offering water I couldn't bring myself to drink and asking questions I could hardly hear. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the pale shimmer of that strange growth clinging to the tree, the slow pulse beneath its surface, and the warped outline of Noah's pack, half claimed by it. The air in the room tasted stale, a mix of old paper, and the faint chemical smell from the hallway floor wax. When they finally drove me back to Olympia, dawn was just starting to tint the eastern sky, turning the wet pavement into a wash of pink and gray. The city was waking in its usual way, cars humming down quiet streets, porch lights blinking off one by one, but none of it felt familiar anymore. Over the next days, specialists from the state and federal agencies moved into the forest. They wore full protective suits that whispered as they walked the material stiff under the heavy humid air trapped beneath the trees. I wasn't allowed near the site, but I was briefed at the ranger station where the scent of damp wool and pine resin hung on everyone's clothes. They showed me diagrams, carefully sanitized, nothing graphic, explaining how they'd isolated the growth, sealed it inside a polymer shell, and neutralized it with controlled agents. Their voices were steady, but I could hear the strain beneath the surface, the fatigue of people confronting something without precedent. When the confirmation finally came that the items found in that clearing were unquestionably Noah's, and that the notes pulled from the edge of the growth had been written in his hand, I felt something in me give way. Not collapse exactly, more like a quiet internal settling a weight finding its final place. My mother came over the night I told her. She held my hand on the couch, her thumb brushing the back of my knuckles in slow circles, the way she used to when I was a child with a fever. The living room smelled like leftover soup and lemon cleanser, and outside the windows, the rain fell in straight, soft lines that blurred the streetlights. She didn't say I'm sorry, or he's in a better place. She just sat with me, and the silence between us felt like the only honest response either of us had left. News traveled fast through Olympia. People I barely knew left voicemails or casseroles on my doorstep, unsure what else to offer. Some asked if I needed company. Others left long pauses on the line, not knowing how to end a message like that. At the clinic, Linda hugged me so gently, I almost didn't feel her arms around me, just the warmth of her cheek against my shoulder and the faint scent of her floral hand lotion. Patients spoke in hushed tones in the waiting room, their voices drifting through the glass like echoes. For a little while, the city felt smaller, like everyone had stepped closer in the quietest possible way. Despite all the people involved, the case never had the shape of a crime. There was no arrest to be made, no courtroom drama, no suspect to name. Instead, it settled into a strange category none of us knew how to talk about: an environmental event, an encounter with a life form that didn't fit neatly into anything familiar. Officials released only a brief statement to the public citing hazardous biological activity and closing off a section of the forest indefinitely. Most folks accepted the vague explanation, chalking it up to something related to invasive fungi or chemical contamination from old logging sites. Only a handful of us knew what had really been found and what it meant. And even we didn't have the words for all of it. The preservation zone they created around that clearing changed the routines in Skamania County. Rangers walked new patrol lines. Signs went up simple but stern warning hikers to stay clear. At night, the forest roads near Lake Tapshaw stayed emptier than before headlights' less frequent windows rolled up instead of down. People said the woods felt different, still more watchful. It wasn't just superstition. Even the rangers admitted that the silence in that area had a thickness to it, like a held breath that never quite exhaled. As for me, time didn't soften the edges of what happened so much as make space around them. I went back to work because the rhythm helped the chirp of the clinic door when patients arrived, the shuffle of forms across my desk, the clean snap of folders closing. Those sounds grounded me, reminded me that the world kept moving, even when I felt like I'd stepped out of its rhythm. I tried to cook again, though the smell of anything sweet for a while made me think of that clearing and the cloying scent in the air there. For months I kept my windows shut at night, even when the weather warmed. I couldn't bear the thought of waking to that same forest smell drifting into my home. Eventually, I made a small memorial for him. Nothing dramatic. Just a simple wooden plaque tucked into the ground beside a turnout near Lake Tapshaw, the last place I knew for certain he'd been safely himself. The soil was softer there than I expected, and when I pressed the sign into it, the earth gave way with a quiet, steady resistance. I sat beside it on a fallen trunk, the bark rough beneath my palms, and listened to the muted sounds of the forest, the distant murmur of water, a single jay calling from high in the canopy. I didn't speak. I just breathed, letting the cool air fill my lungs as I tried to imagine him walking through that same stretch of trees on that last morning. There's a kind of acceptance that doesn't announce itself. It doesn't arrive with clarity or peace. It comes in slow, uneven steps through quiet mornings when you don't feel hollow, through evenings when the shadows in your home don't unsettle you, through the first time you can say someone's name out loud without bracing for impact. I didn't reach it all at once, but in the years since I've learned to live alongside the pieces of the story rather than fight them. Sometimes when I'm driving past the outskirts of Gifford Pinchot, I'll pull off to the shoulder and step out for a minute. The air there has its own weight, rich with moss and cold water sharp with resin from the older trees. I'll stand by the roadside, listening to the forest breathe, feeling the breeze tug at my hair. And every now and then, when the light slants just right between the trunks, I'm reminded of how much of nature we still don't understand, how small we really are in the face of what lies beyond the edges of our knowledge. It doesn't frighten me the way it once did, but it humbles me. What happened to Noah reshaped the boundaries of my life. It carved out a space I never asked for and never wanted, but one I've come to recognize as part of who I am. I carry him with me, not in sorrow alone, but in the quiet moments when the world feels still and honest. In the smell of rain on cedar. In the way the fog drifts low across the ground on early fall mornings. In the hush of the woods at dusk. There's one image that stays with me more than any other, that clearing after the suits and trucks were gone after the cocoon was sealed and the air grew cold again. The trees stood stripped and silent under the evening sky, the forest around it waiting as if listening to a story only it could hear. Sometimes in my mind, the breeze moves gently through those branches, and the quiet that follows feels deep enough to hold everything we lost. If you're still here with me, let me know where you're listening from, and follow the channel, so these stories are never forgotten.